Thursday, this story is this story about his story of mental health. Once a month, this appears on the main feed, and that is this full episode for everyone. Weekly, there is a Thursday This Story that appears on the patrons feed for those that are Patreon subscribers. Hi, patrons. Love y'all. If you want to hear the weekly, there's Thursday This Stories as well as other bonus content. Go to patreon.com/brokenbrain or dwighthurst.com/support to sign up. Your donation to Patreon will also go, 50% of it will go towards the charity of focus within the month that you donated. So, for example, in the month of June 2024, our charity of focus is Out Nebraska, which is an organization that provides community education, legislative efforts, and generally makes efforts to make life better and happier and healthier for queer people who live in Nebraska. So half of your Patreon donation will go to that for the duration of your membership on Patreon. But let's get into it. This week, we're going to talk about the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin, which would be 100 years old over that, actually, if it had not been torn apart by the Nazis. The story of this clinic, which was the first place where research and documentation on trans individuals started taking place, it really starts with Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a German physician and became a specialist in areas of sex and sexuality because of his own experiences. Hirschfeld was both Jewish and gay, growing up and living in Germany. He was born in 1868 in Poland and died in 1935 at the age of 67 years in Nice, France. He was forced to live in exile outside of Germany and Poland when Hitler was appointed. That was in apparently 1933. But his whole life he worked to promote rights and equality for those that, in the terminology of the day, would say did not conform to gender or sexual norms. So that would be, a way of saying LGBTQA plus individuals, just in different terminology back then, of course. So Hirschfeld tells a story of how one day a German soldier, came to his practice and came to talk to him, labeling himself an Urning. I don't know if that's the right German pronunciation, but it was a word at the time that was used to refer to homosexual men. At the time, there was a law in the books known as Paragraph 175, which made any sexual contact between men illegal. And so you can see where that would be very concerning for a soldier in the army to talk about losing his career, losing his rank and everything, and as well being jailed. This was a young man that was engaged to a woman and was in a very, very terrible psychological plight. Once again, Hirschfeld was gay himself and, had a lot of empathy for this situation. The soldier committed suicide on the eve of his wedding. Saying he could not face that and face living a lie. He left some private papers to Hirschfeld and in a letter to him wrote, "The thought that you could contribute to a future when the German fatherland will think of us in more just terms sweetens the hour of death." Hirschfeld reported that this haunted him the rest of his life, this needless and tragic loss. And this apparently was one of the larger triggers that caused him to specialize in sexuality and sexual health. At the time, there was a lot of growing interest in this area. Homosexuality was thought of as a pathology and was often thought of as a mental illness problem. And unfortunately, that persisted up until some revisions of, I think, the DSM-3. So, that mentality persisted. And unfortunately, although in this generation, it's even just in my years of working in mental health, I've seen this get a little bit better. This number is shrinking, perhaps due to retirement or, other things. That the population of people who believe this has gotten smaller. But even in the mental health field, I have in my career heard people talk about the idea that, homosexuality develops because of an emotionally absent father. And so that's something that has unfortunately persisted, but was extremely bad, obviously, at that time. So Hirschfeld was considered to be a radical at this time in the early 20th century. And there was a trend amongst people to try to be more scientific and to study and discuss things more openly. We tend to look at the past as always more closed. And I think it's important to remember that bigotry, hatred, and totalitarianism, it always lashes out against something. If we try to look back and say everybody in the past was wrong and terrible, then we would be ignoring a lot of the research and civil rights movement of those that chose to express themselves and to work hard in very dangerous environments to be able to do that. So we have to remember that those people also existed, and that, even if it was more common to have bigotry to the point of violence and things like that, unfortunately, that's not gone today either. But just because that was present and sometimes more institutionalized in some countries, it doesn't mean that there weren't people that were fighting, and we need to remember who they are. Although considered to be radically progressive, Hirschfeld was treated as an expert in this area of sexuality because he was one of the most outspoken individuals who was studying it and talking about it. He was also one who talked about same-sex attraction, as is also called at the time, but as an inherent inborn trait, which very progressive for the time, and also one of the linchpins of bigotry. People who do not believe that tend to find a much easier time falling into discrimination and bigotry than those who it's a settled matter for. I think people who are embracing of this true idea that people, have their sexuality as something that is just a part of their life, it's a lot easier to be accepting and to learn to be to quell discrimination. Hirschfeld liked to use the phrase "through science to justice," and believed that, obviously, he believed that homosexuality should not be punished because it was just, a normal developmental type of person. That's everyone has their different orientation and sexuality, so obviously there should not be discrimination either. These were radical things, of course, to say. He fought against paragraph 175 for years with an organization he helped to found called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. And they spent years and years fighting against paragraph 175 and working for the decriminalization of homosexuality in Germany. They were not successful as the Nazis rose to power. Big surprise, I guess, here, if you didn't know. The Nazis, not so cool with queer people. Hirschfeld also talked about what I'm going to pull from an article here in the Holocaust Encyclopedia. The entry about Hirschfeld is really worth reading. But he described, here's a quote, he described a continuous range of unique gender identities, basically promoting that there was a wide variety of gender. And here's a quote from him, between which there are no empty points present, but rather unbroken connecting lines. So a range of both gender and sexual orientation, once again, very groundbreaking, very progressive studies that he was doing. At the time, the term for what we would call transgender individuals that Hirschfeld used was transvestites, which is not the term that we would use now, either medically, clinically, or just colloquially. But that is what he did talk about. So I'll be using the abbreviation trans to refer to what he was referring to, as people nowadays, we would use that term comfortably, trans. So the reason I feel like we can use that term is that there is a definition, obviously, of transvestites, but the definition at the time included people who preferred to live, act in ways that were traditionally associated with, opposite to their assigned gender at birth, and, as Hirschfeld put it, and I'll quote here, from the point of view of their character, should be considered as the opposite sex. So he was very gender affirming at a time where the term gender affirming did not really exist. He also went beyond that to recognize that trans individuals could be homosexual or heterosexual. In other words, separating out orientation from gender identity. So this is very important because when you hear people nowadays, this is a very hot, divisive topic where people are very aggressive. There's a lot of hatred and bigotry nowadays that people are being very open about. One of the things I hear people say is, why did this just happen? Why did this just get invented? Now, there's lots of indications throughout history of stories of both trans individuals and gender fluidity in other cultures. But, we're going back here to the turn of the century, not this century, the one before, the turn of the century that we meant when I was a kid and we said that. There was knowledge of many of these principles that I just mentioned are many of the ones that people still want to argue about today. And here was someone in an environment, in a culture that was very, very negative, and through scientific observation and very closeted, very dangerous to talk about these things, was observing some of the same things that we accept medically and psychologically today in the medical field. Another article you should read if you're interested in learning more about this is The Forgotten History of the World's First Trans Clinic in Scientific American. If you Google those terms, Forgotten History, Trans Clinic, Scientific American, Hirschfeld, you'll find it. I have faith in you. In fact, we can step back to the 19th century. There was a man named Richard von Krafft-Ebing who was a predecessor in what they called sexology and studying these things. So they were in the 19th century talking about how homosexuality was a natural variation of sexuality. In 1919, Hirschfeld established the Institute for Sexual Research, and he set it up in a villa in Berlin. And between then and 1930, so I mean, we're talking about like 11 years, it would perform gender affirmation treatments and surgeries, the first that had happened reportedly anywhere in the world from an official medical standpoint. In this article, The Forgotten History in Scientific American, there's some quotes here talking about how the Institute was set up like a home. It was set up with, intimate living space type of furniture that Hirschfeld wanted it to be full of life everywhere. There's a quote here. The stated purpose of the organization was to be, quote, place of research, teaching, healing, and refuge that could free the individual from physical ailments, psychological afflictions, and social deprivation. And by the way, this is one of those things when we talk about gender affirming care, and I'm actually sort of doing a little research on a project that should appear as an episode. One of the things that we don't talk about enough is the effects of societal discrimination, fear, the trauma of having to live in secret, and those things. So when people like to point to gender affirming care and they like to ask questions like, well, does it work? Are people happier? And all that stuff, it's like, well, okay, there's a lot of other things that require treatment as well. So part of gender affirming care should also be recovery for, the discrimination, bigotry that comes on someone who needs gender affirming care. So that's something that I think is, I'm going to say misunderstood, more often misrepresented, to make it sound like, oh, if you go through gender affirming care, you don't get better automatically. And though there is indication that you do have a significant mental health increase, yeah, sure, it's not magic. It's not like it makes all the trauma and depression go away. And by the way, trans people are what? People. So therefore, they also, it's similar, they're more at risk with risk factors for lots of trauma and kinds of experiences, but also subject to health issues just like anybody else. The grounds of the Institute also had offices for feminist activists, and they also had a printing house for different journals and studies that they were publishing, as well as lobbying for public policy changes, once again, fighting paragraph 175. And interesting, this was very interesting. Hirschfeld also got, it says in this one article I read, legally accepted. I'm not sure, can't find exactly what that means, but there was some legal recognition for transvestite identity cards that he would create for his patients that were made for the purposes of trying to prevent arrest for simply dressing and even living as the opposite sex. So this is some wild stuff that we just don't think about, and we're not taught about enough about this. Male to female transition and affirming surgeries were offered at this location that had to do with basically progressing the gender affirming care to physical surgical procedures. Interestingly enough, female to male phalloplasty didn't really come around until the 1940s, according to the reading that I'm doing. So this was very focused on gay men and trans women, male to female, affirmation. They did also have hormone therapy that they would give at the same time. So this is a really fully functional trans clinic, also collecting lots of research, interviews, and different kinds of data that was being gathered. Once again, Hirschfeld's big belief was in science to help heal culture. On May 6, 1933, Nazi troops, this is after Hitler became chancellor, came in and swarmed the building, destroyed it, burned books, all of that. A bonfire. According to one article I read, more than 20,000 books, some of them one-of-a-kind copies that provided the history of non-conforming people, non-conforming to gender roles and genders assigned at birth, that there was tons of information that was burned. Hirschfeld was out of the country, and one of his partners, Dr. Geiss, took some stuff and took off, and basically they were able to escape with their lives. This was, by the way, one of the first of the famous Nazi book burnings. Hirschfeld's image was put on propaganda materials as well, and he was labeled as there's a quote from that article in Scientific American, the worst kind of offender, both Jewish and homosexual, to the perfect heteronormative Aryan race. Hirschfeld was also often assaulted, that frequently happened when he would travel internationally for speaking tours from Nazi sympathizers and basically other hateful, bigoted individuals, obviously. For example, in 1920, he was beaten so badly by a group of Nazi sympathizers that he was initially declared dead, but did recover. He was eventually immigrated to France, where, as mentioned before, he passed away. We could say that Magnus Hirschfeld, a really good example, obviously, one of the early examples of someone who in the medical world really put his money where his mouth was. He really got into the game and worked hard for gay and trans rights. That before we had, all of the infrastructure around caring about LGBTQA plus individuals and having a lot of different study and definition and things, he had already gone very, very far to produce that. If it had been in a nation where his research and his historical documents and his films and all of the things, all the many things that he was able to compile, if his clinic had been able to survive at that time, it is interesting to wonder and think about what might have happened. What would be the norms today if we had a little bit of that jump in research? Maybe it's optimistic to say that it would be different. I just don't know for sure, but it's an interesting what if to float out there. So thank you for listening to my little history dive. Once again, if you want to learn more about this topic and more about Hirschfeld, I would suggest going to the Holocaust Encyclopedia. You can go to that Scientific American article that I mentioned, which is called The Forgotten History of the World's First Trans Clinic. And there's various sources, but I would say those are the two that I got some of the most good information from. You can also go and search out Hirschfeld and his works. He's written several books, and there's a lot out there that you can see that existed back when he was there. So enjoy this. Hopefully we'll see you next week for regular episodes and another entry in Thursday, the story of mental health.